I'm really excited to welcome you back for our afternoon, which we are starting with a panel that I'm very excited about, all of the panels, to talk about this. Our next panel features artists of the Kamoinge Workshop, Ming Smith, Adger Cowans, who also wants me to make sure to tell you all he is a member of AfriCobra also, and Dawoud Bey. This afternoon, the artists are joined in conversation with one of the nation's leading historians of African American photography and curators of African American culture, Deb Willis. I am really honored that everyone on this stage agreed to come and speak with us this afternoon, so please join me in welcoming them.
Thank you, Lauren, and thank you all for being here. It's really a pleasure. I'm really excited about the idea of visualizing Kamoinge based on the history. I'm excited because this panel gives us an opportunity to highlight 3 outstanding photographers. I'd like to quote Lou Draper. He says that we saw ourselves as a group who were trying to nurture each other. We had no outlets. The magazines wouldn't support our work. So we wanted to encourage each other to give each other our own feedback. We tried to be a force, especially for young people. So starting with this group photograph here, to consider the history of contemporary photography and the works of African American photographers, I often reference the work and commitment of 2 entities, the Kamoinge Workshop and the Black Photographers Annual. These 2 mainstays in the pantheon of African American photography nourished and preserved and published the works of Black photographers at a time when most were being ignored and overlooked by publishers, journalists, curators, museums, and galleries. Both also understood the impact of photographic images, many of which were used as weapons against Black communities and creating a sense of Black humanity. Kamoinge began officially in 1963. Initially, the photographers met in their homes to discuss and critique photography. The group expanded its members with Roy DeCarava in 1963 as a mentor and advisor, and other members started with Anthony Barboza in 1963, Buford Smith, and then Adger, Lou Draper, Danny Dawson, and Ming Smith, among others. The Black Photographers Annuals were published in 1972 by Joe Crawford, Buford Smith, and Joe Walker. During its tenure, it published work of over 80 photographers, introducing new works and new ideas about how to think about photography, how to collect photography. Kamoinge did not just pick up the camera, but they also used the photograph to create a way of observing, documenting, and photographing and interpreting Black life experiences. This panel, you'll see, through their work, they bear witness, they contemplate, they celebrate, and appreciate and travel along with the communities and with the idea of what it means to be a photographer. These photographers became even more compelling as we look closely at the faces of older women, men walking, jazz musicians, and the photographs enliven us as we think about the way that they were seeking and searching for the idea of truth. How do we think about truth through the photographic images? We'll see it through the work of Dawoud Bey. And here are just a few images of some of the photographers. Some of them, as we can see, began to publish, and some began to consider ways about their communities, distributing ideas, making a personal vision through Lou Draper. And the idea of Lou Draper, he was concerned about telling a story about how to look at photography. He also, as a teacher, understood how angles were formed and desired. So thinking about how his community and the way he looked at photography in New York City, girls going to school, graphic moments. Buford also looked at activism within the community. And so these are the moments that we'd like to share today.
Thank you. So what I'm going to do this afternoon is just briefly show you 2 related projects, one of which is the first project that I undertook from 1975 to 1979, Harlem, USA. And then more recently, 40 years later, I've gone back to Harlem, and for the last 4 years, have been making a new group of photographs there. But to go back to the beginnings, my beginnings go back to 1969, when I was 16 years old, and controversy erupted around the exhibition Harlem on My Mind at the Metropolitan Museum. And of course, that was a moment of controversy that erupted not only around the Met, but around the Whitney and other museums as well, as people began to realize that museums were not benign institutions, that they could be spoken back to, challenged, and otherwise engaged. And in 1969, the controversy around Harlem on My Mind kind of erupted into the media. And I heard about this exhibition when I was 16 years old, living in Queens, New York. And so one Saturday afternoon, I decided to go and see what the controversy was about. I'm pretty sure I wasn't going to see the exhibition because I didn't have a sense of the exhibition. I was going to see the controversy. I knew that there were demonstrations taking place, and by then, without going into any great detail, I had been fairly active socially and politically as a teenager. So one Saturday afternoon, I ventured to the Met to see the controversy, and as fate would have it, there were no demonstrations outside of the Met that day. And over the years, I've come to think that there were no demonstrations because fate conspired for them to not be there so that I could go inside and see the exhibition and begin what has become my life. Because, quite frankly, had the picket lines been there, I don't even know that I would have gone inside. So they weren't. And I ventured into the Met, first time I'd ever been to a museum exhibition on my own, a completely intimidating experience, so much so that I didn't even have the wherewithal to walk up to the information desk and say, "Excuse me, can you tell me where the Harlem on My Mind exhibition is?" All of the people walking around in there appeared to me to know where they were going. So I just thought I would walk around. I'll act like I know where I'm going, and I would hopefully find this exhibition, which I did. And it was a moment that pretty much changed everything for me. Seeing black people on the walls of a museum and seeing people looking at photographs of black people on the wall of a museum was the moment that I began to attach some tangible ambition to what I might do with the camera that I had gotten from my godmother the year before. It was the moment that I began to seriously consider what my subject might be. So out of the experience of that moment with Harlem on My Mind and my own family's history, my mother and father lived in Harlem for a time. My mother and father met in Harlem at St. John's Baptist Church on 152nd Street. So Harlem is the beginning of my personal narrative. And out of my family's history and the history of seeing that exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum in 1975, I started making my own photographs in Harlem, spending approximately 5 years making the work. And when I was about 3/4 of the way through the project, I approached the Studio Museum in Harlem to ask them if they would be interested in showing the work when it was completed, which became my first exhibition. My approach in Studio Museum in Harlem was directly related to one of the controversies at the Met, which was this idea of images of a particular community being shown outside of that community, whereby the people in the community didn't have ready access to images that were of and about them. So I very intentionally wanted to have the first exhibition of that work situated in the community in which the work had been made, as a way to kind of conflate this notion of subject and audience, that they can be the same thing. So I spent 5 years working on this project. And during this time, I had begun looking at a lot of other photographs. I became aware through initially Black Photographers Annual and then Kamoinge that there was indeed a community of African American photographers, which was a hugely affirmative moment for me. And then along with that work, I started looking at other work by people like Mike Disfarmer. So a small Mike Disfarmer show at MoMA, Irving Penn's small trade photograph, trying to figure out the visual language to attach to the subject that I knew I wanted to make work out of. So I spent 5 years making these Harlem, USA photographs. Had the initial exhibition at Studio Museum in Harlem, and that work went out into the world in various forms, most recently being shown again for the first time since its original exhibition at Studio Museum in Harlem at the Art Institute of Chicago, who also published the first complete set of those photographs in a book. But for me, the work was about making images within this community that contributed something to the history of Harlem's visual and photographic representation. I wanted to contribute to that larger culture of the place that was Harlem through this work. And then in 2014, I had, of course, been visiting Harlem periodically, but in response to the increasingly rapid changes that the community was undergoing, I wanted to make work about what that change looks like. How can one insert themselves into that change as it's taken place and make photographs about the reshaping of this particular community. The work for me is about a number of things. Obviously, it's about change, it's about absence, it's about loss, a kind of shift in the notion of what we would call place memory, and how to make some work about that, to raise questions about what that means through a group of photographs. So I'm actually still in the midst of this project. I thought I was finished, and then I was in Harlem about 2 weeks ago. And I looked out of the back window at a gallery that I was at and saw something that made me realize that I wasn't quite finished. So I'll be going back. But this work, for me, stands certainly in a very real conversation with the work that I first set out to make in Harlem in the mid to late 1970s. Very different photographs, of course, as I'm a very different person, very different artist than I was in 1975. And the notion of photographic language is certainly very different now than it was at the time I began that earlier work as well. Thank you.
Thank you. To Adger.
I grew up during the end of the Second World War, so my whole idea about photography came from my mother's books of photography and different magazines. There were only a few magazines: Life magazine, Look magazine, National Geographic. Those were the only books that had photography in them. There were no books on photography when I started taking pictures. My junior year in school, there was a book that came out on the history of photography by Belmont Newhall. And there were no African Americans or anybody else in there. It was all the white photographers and only the older ones. It didn't include people like Eugene Smith, et cetera, but all the old style photography. So there were no books. So, I got started in photography quite by accident. This is my mother's family. I'm sitting beside my grandfather. I grew up in a very positive black household with a big family. I didn't have any problems about being black. I was very proud to be black. And I had heroes in my family. My cousin, Earl Sherrard, flew with the 99th and was a fighter pilot and was decorated. He had Purple Heart, all that stuff. And then when he came home, we always went over to see him because he was such a great guy. My grandfather worked on a railroad as an oiler. My father was a butler. There was a doctor, a fireman, a policeman, a mailman, and a traveler. He's standing in the back there by the pole between my mother and father. He was a bad boy. And so I got named after him. And I have his life story. He was a whole boy. He was a cowboy. He was, he did a lot of things. So I'm writing his life story. But he used to tell me all these stories, And half the time I didn't believe him. But anyway, this is my mother's family. I got my first camera by signing my father's name. During that time, the Second World War, they came out with a new system where you could buy things on time. So I went downtown and signed my father's name. My father's name is Adger Watson Cowans. My name is Adger Wilbur Cowans. So I signed Adger W. Cowans. So a couple of weeks later, when all the equipment came, my father hit the roof. I mean, we were not rich. We weren't poor, but we weren't rich either. My father hit the ceiling. He went crazy. And my mother said, well, honey, that's what he wants to do, and so she got him off me. He beat the snot out of me first, though. I mean, he whipped me, But I told him I would pay him back, and I did, When I came to New York, and the first job I got, I made $250 a week. Now, this is in 1958. When I was born, you could buy a bushel of corn for $1. You could fill up your tank with $2.50, you could fill up your tank and drive all week long. Everything was cheaper. Everything. So I grew up in that period where there was black people were strong back then. To me, there was, you get in a fight and a guy would cut a guy, and the next week he'd be on the street. But, there was just there was a certain power in the black community. But I grew up with this family, and everything that I learned from all these people has carried me to this day. This is a picture I shot of Mick Jagger in Brazil in 1968. I was in Brazil, in Copacabana, and my sister said, oh, Mick Jagger's downstairs. He was there because, he'd been arrested for drugs. I mean, he and Mary Ann Faith were there, so she said, oh, he's down there by the pool. I said, I don't care about Mick Jagger. I went back to sleep. And I got up later and went down and started talking to him. He seemed to be, a very nice guy and very smart, very knowledgeable. So when we were leaving, we said, we're going to Bahia. He said, we are too. So we got on the plane together, and that's where I shot that picture. This is at Ali's birthday party. This is like 1970-something. And I was working on a movie with Calvin Lockhart, and he said, I got to go to Ali's birthday party. Why don't you be my photographer and go with me? And I did. So this picture I shot at Ali's birthday party, and what I love about the picture was Ali picked the mic and said, "I'm holding the mic for Stevie Wonder." He was like so proud, you know, but it was a great moment, and I just love the gesture. This is a picture that got me in big trouble. Big trouble. I went to see this guy. Somebody said Sidney Poitier is looking for a black photographer to work on a movie. So I went to see him, and he was flipping through my book and flipping. He got that picture, and he walked out of the room. And so his producer came, and it seemed like 20 minutes. I sat there by myself, and he came in, and he said, "You know, Sidney was supposed to marry Diana when they were shooting in Paris Blues, and it didn't happen." He said, "I think he probably still has some feeling about her." So anyway, to make a long story short, he never hired me. But his producer sent me this guy at the United Artists, and I worked on the first picture by a black director, Ossie Davis, called Cotton Comes to Harlem. So that was the first movie I worked on. I was invited, I'll say, voted in to the International Photographers of the Motion Picture Industry. And I got in 1969. I was the first black person. And it was really something to get in there. But one of the guys called me and said, "Adger, there was a vote and it was even." He said, "But I broke the vote because I saw your work and I like what you do and got you in the union." So that was 1969. This is a picture I shot in 1960 when I was getting out of the Navy. I was so happy. And I saw this picture. I said, "Oh, it's an omen, beauty." And so I 2 days later, I left the Navy and I came to New York City. And I was married, and we moved to Harlem, and I lived on 150th Street and Convent Avenue. We lived in somebody else's apartment. We had a 7-room apartment. We had 3 little rooms in the back. And, you know, every day I would go out and shoot. And I would shoot pictures. I had a Leica. When I was in college, I wanted a Leica so bad. That was Eugene Smith used a Leica. All these bad guys used a Leica. I wanted a Leica. But a Leica was $300. That was a lot of money. So I asked my aunt. She was pretty well off. And I said, "I really want this." She said, "Well, I'll think about it." She said, "If I give it to you, it's going to be Thanksgiving, birthday, Christmas, everything." I said, "Oh, that's okay." So she sent me 300 brand new $1 bills for a Christmas present. I gave them to my buddy Tabor Chadwick, and he came to New Jersey. He came up with a brand new Leica. Oh, man. So I used Leica for a lot of pictures. I shot this picture. And I like this picture because it has a couple of things going on with the lighthouse and the clothesline. This is a picture I shot. I called it Icarus. I shot at Orchard Beach in New York. And I had just gotten a 21 millimeter lens, and so they were throwing this little girl up in a blanket. So I got up close and shot against the sky. And since there are no lines in the sky, there was no forward and back. It was just flat. So it looks like she's falling from the sun. This is a picture of the great poetess, Ntozake Shange. This is one of my newer pictures I shot last year for her book that she was doing. And I like it because she put her magic coat on. I call her magic coat. You know, she has all these symbols on it, but she's a great playwright and poet. This is a picture of Rakim. Rakim was the baddest of the bad. You know, yeah. And, you know, they said, "Oh, you're going to photograph Rakim." And at the time, I said, "Who's Rakim? I don't know. I know Miles, I don't know Rakim." So I listened to his music, and I liked what he was doing because he had some elements of jazz in it. So when I met him, the first thing he said, "I love John Coltrane." Well, we were like that after that. So I had a really nice time talking with him and photographing him, and he was just a great person and much wiser than people would think. You know, they think he's a brother on the street, but he was very wise and very knowledgeable and a wonderful person. Yes? Who that talking? Okay. This is a picture that I shot, and I put a texture over it. It's called The Secret, because I knew if this lady saw this picture, she would kill me. So So I decided that I would make it a little more magical, you know. And I showed it to her. She said, "Is that me?" I said, "Oh, no, that's somebody else." Had to tell a lie, you know. But I love it because it gives, I call it the secret, because it's still, you know, you're still dealing with a photograph. You're dealing with something that challenges you. My concept of photography is to challenge the mind and jumpstart the imagination. Tupac, from the movie Juice, and he was off the chain. It was his first movie, and he didn't hardly know what to do. He was just all over the place, you know. But he turned out to be quite a nice guy, you know, and every time I would see him after that, he'd be with his voice, "Hey, ass man, come hang out." And he was really very, very intelligent person. If you read what he wrote and his writing and his poems, he was very, very, very smart person, very knowledgeable. And that's it? Oh, my God. Okay.
Okay.
I forgot one thing. I have a book, my first book, that was published finally, and you can get it in the bookstore here. It's called Personal Vision, 50 Years of My Photography. It does everything, street, landscape, my movie work, portraits, everything. So it's in the workshop there. Okay? Thank you.
Ming?
This is called The American Dream. And with my photography, I've tried to include the blues and the funk aesthetic. I wanted to take images, but I wanted to, like, music was the biggest inspiration for my work. And when I shoot and when I developed, I always had music on, whether it was jazz or blues. And I wanted the feeling of, I wanted the work to feel like a Billie Holiday song. The emotion and everything that Billie Holiday was about. She was also very political, and she had great feeling, and I felt her as a child. I had been to Paris, and I went to all the different museums, the Louvre, and I remember going to see Rodin's The Kiss. And when I came back, I wanted to do nudes. And so this is my male nude, and that's my female nude. This is Grace Jones before she left for Paris. We were all trying to, we were pioneers. We were all trying to be someone to win. We were all basically in our 20s, and this is before she became the Grace Jones. And this was actually, I carried my camera always, and she was there at the dresser place. My first exhibition, one-woman exhibition, was at a hairdressing place in New York on Madison, and I had all my photographs up, and this was new, was my first show, and Romar Bearden and also Roy DeCarava came, and that really gave me the encouragement to keep on. They said, "Oh, you're really good." So it really meant a lot to me, and they told me to continue. But the hairdresser, because there was no place really to show. I mean, we weren't in any galleries, or there was only the Studio Museum. And my first visit to the Studio Museum, there was Mel Edwards and Jane Cortez and painters, and with those folks that I remember them because I have photographs that I took. So their energy and just knowing to be an artist, it was like that influenced who I am today. They inspired me. Ed Clark was there, and this is my first trip to Africa, to Dakar. Child Porter, that was taken in Abidjan. Raise Your Window High. Albert Murray titled that. I was always, Roy DeCarava did a book with Langston Hughes, and I aspired to do a book like that. I was interested in how other artists affected or inspired each other. Like August Wilson, he loved Ramar Bearden. He stood outside of his studio, and he rang him up on the telephone, and when Ramar Bearden answered the phone, he hung up because he was so afraid. And but I was like, if they knew each other or had met, what a conversation, because they were so similar, very high intellects, and they were always thinking about things, and they were very the culture and the people. That's in Harlem. What's it all about? Now, this is part of I have bodies of work, and one of my main bodies of work is For August Wilson. When I saw his play, I was so inspired. I went to the Hill District, took a bus with my camera, and I photographed the places where he drew his inspiration, which was in a restaurant, in the pool hall, his mother's house. This was this is The Invisible Man, which came out of that body of work, and it was acquired in MoMA, in the permanent collection in MoMA in 1990. That's Sun Ra, who's one of the pioneers of Afrofuturism. This is Flamingo Fandango, which was a Duke Ellington song. And that's In the Wings, David Murray. This was the first piece in 1979 that was acquired by that was selected by John Sarkowski to be in the permanent collection at MoMA. This piece is called Angst. This is Amiri Baraka, who started the Black arts movement, which was at the same time as the Black Power movement. He started a theater in Harlem. But Angst, when I looked up Angst, I was like, I always called it Angst, because this piece represented to me like what we go through, what our souls go through, making the conflict that goes on within us. And I think every artist or every person goes through that as a Black person living in America. And when I looked up Angst to make sure it was the right word, because I just referred to this piece as Angst, they had a photograph, painting of The Scream by Edvard Munch, and I was like, yeah, that's what it was. It's like a silence thing. You know, you're always trying to figure things out, how to do things, you know. that's what's going on for Marvin Gaye. In this photograph, you see the violence, you see the children, and also you see where the music, which has helped us get through our struggle and our pain. That's Pas de Deux, that came out of the Coney Island series. And that's Red Hot Jazz. That's My Father's Tears. Sunflowers, Going with Darkness and Light. When I saw this image, I was traveling with my ex's band, and we were going from one city to the next, and so I was pretty quiet. I would just photograph, and then I saw this image, and I was like, oh, that's, of course, Van Gogh painted sunflowers because they were so beautiful. You know, any artist, if they saw that, would want to paint that. And so I was always real quiet, but I asked him, please, please, after we almost passed it over, and said, let me just take 2 minutes to jump out and take a photograph. And that's how I got this. But it's called Going with Darkness and Light, and Going, G-O-G-H-I-N-G. And also sunflowers. I love sunflowers, and sunflowers are a symbol of hope, and they always turn towards the sun. Universal consciousness, transcendence. This is for Alice Coltrane. As I paint on my photographs also.
So we have a minute left. Yeah, over time.
Okay, and that's it.
Okay. So we have less than 30 seconds left, but I had 3 questions, but I think I'll just ask one. Is it okay, Maura? Just one question for all of you. Just walking through and listening and observing the work, I'm noticing this sense of memory, how we consider post-Kamoinge within the notion of Kamoinge, the act of working within that frame, that your work is about portraits, landscape, urban life, but also the aesthetic changed over time. I was curious, my first question was how photography shaped your life, but now I'm curious about, what were the meetings like beyond the point, where are you now in photography, who are you talking to with the engagement of the stories of the sunflower? We have art history, we have the reference of the Met and Harlem on my mind, and then family. Family shaped your life in photography. So I'm just curious, how do we merge and tell that one story through the experience of your encounter with photography, and how do you see it forward?
Well, to specifically reference Kamoinge for me, because that is the frame for this larger discussion. I don't know that it answers your question directly, but for me, one of the things that was most refreshing and reassuring to me about Kamoinge as a young Black photographer was that the work clearly did not conform to any orthodoxy, that the sense of expressive possibility within the medium, as an example set by the range of works being made by the members of Kamoinge, was the thing that most struck me You know, when I first saw the work, Alpha Now was doing these very minimal kind of landscapes. Other photographers are working within the genre of what might be called street photography. And I think the expansive sense of possibility that their work represents still, for me, holds true in terms of this notion of being a black artist working in the contemporary moment, but also being free from having to conform to any notion of a particular orthodoxy. And for me, that traces directly back to my initial encounter with Kamoinge. So I don't know if that's your question.
It is.
But for me,
that full
my
circle.
own sense that I have the freedom to find whatever particular material and visual language for the photograph supports the idea of the thing that I need to talk about. That freedom from any kind of constraints, for me, goes back certainly to Kamoinge. In a way that I think is important, because when people think about black photographic practice, there might be a tendency to think of it largely within the frame of street photography, which has, of course, never been true. And I think Kamoinge was, for me, the first affirmation of that.
And Africoba and Kamoinge, how do you wrap in terms of create this notion of connecting the past to the present and to these two groups?
I think the reason I wanted to be part of Africoba is the fact that these guys were defining their own destiny. They weren't waiting for somebody else to tell them what and how to do and be. I was one of the original founders of the Kamoinge Work. It was called the Kamoinge Workshop. Before that, it was Gallery 20. And we merged with this other group of guys that did not have a name. And we decided when we merged that we would have one name. And they wanted to have an African name, and I didn't want to have an African name. They wanted to be a black group, but I didn't want it to be a black group. I wanted to be the photographic group. I wanted to be dynamite photography. So we kind of came in between there, and then came up with Kamoinge, but still being one of the founding members and a contributor to a lot to the ideas, because I had graduated from OU and I had a degree in photography, which was a rare thing at that time. So I had a lot of expertise and the latest knowledge of photography, and I brought that to the group and helped everybody bring up their skills. And the whole idea was to be excellent with the work you shot, whether it was black people, whether it was, didn't matter what it was, as long as the work that you did was of quality, it had heart, it had feeling, had meaning.
Okay. Unfortunately, we have the stop sign, and Ming will be here, and all three will be here, and hopefully you'll have a chance to have a one-to-one conversation with all of them. And I thank you all for your devoted attention to this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.